There we go. Thank you. Oh, more people coming in. Thank you very much. Well, welcome back to the fourth of the seminars of the Fellows of the Knapp Foundation. It's my pleasure this week to introduce Professor Nader El-Bizri. Nader is a senior research fellow at the Warburg Institute, an affiliated scholar with the Department of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Cambridge, and an associate of King's College, Cambridge, and of course, a senior research fellow of the Knapp Foundation. Nader's research interests are broad, encompassing Arabic science and philosophy, the history of philosophy, architectural theory, and phenomenology, among others. The breadth of his research portfolio is equally impressive, and his books include the Phenomenological Quest between Avicenna and Heidegger, published in 2000, and Epistles of the Brethren of Purity on Arithmetic and Geometry in 2012. He's also the general editor of the Epistles of the Brethren of Purity as an Arabic-English philosophy series that is published by Oxford University Press, and his current research focuses on the Book of Optics of Al-Haytham. This evening, Nader will discuss the intellectual history of Islam in Europe. Over to you, Nader.
Thank you very much, Aaron, for the introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm really delighted to be part of this series, and it comes in line with the strand of falsafa that is under the Knapp Foundation in terms of the research projects. And I'll just give a kind of overview in line with the talks that have been presented within this series, concerning first setting the wider context for the development of the Arabic and Islamicate sciences and philosophy, before I focus a bit on the aspects of their transmission and integration and adaptation in Europe, with a focus in particular on Ibn al-Haytham, so that I don't just place an emphasis on generalities. And I'm going to just, if you don't mind, share some slides. So in setting the broader context, we have to reflect a bit on the nature of the late antiquity period, particularly in line with the Hellenistic diaspora and its impact over centuries in the Levant and Egypt and even in parts of Mesopotamia. And to say that ultimately the Greek corpus of knowledge, particularly in science and philosophy, had also major centers of learning in Alexandria, as we see it also with the oeuvres of Euclid and Ptolemy, or the development of Neoplatonism in the Nile Delta with the figure of Plotinus, and then works that we find with the legacy of Porphyry of Tyre and the Phoenician Levantine milieu, Boethius of Sidon, Nicomachus of Gerasa in Jordan, and also the closure of the Platonic Academy in Athens in 529 under Justinian, and the migration of the scholars, Neoplatonists further east, many of them already coming from origins that are Phoenician and Syrian. So in a sense, when we come to the period of what scholars refer to in the Islamicate intellectual history as the classical era, particularly that which is marked by the transmission, translation, adaptation, commentary, and critique regarding the Greek corpus, as it is mediated via the Syriac language and then in Arabic translations. It is already a region in the Levant, in Egypt and Mesopotamia, that is saturated by Hellenized forms of production of knowledge in science and philosophy. And this comes as a kind of reflection of an indigenous production of knowledge that interacted with the Hellenistic legacies, and their integration within the new centers of learning emerging in places such as Damascus, Baghdad, Basra, and also in Andalusia. So when we come to the period of Harun al-Rashid. This is the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, and in particular in the beginnings of the 9th century, there's an institutionalized effort to focus on the transmission, translation, and adaptation of Greek knowledge into Arabic, and in many cases via the mediation of the Syriac language. And this happens in centers of learning in Baghdad, in particular, around an institution like the House of Wisdom, Bayt al-Hikmah, which is associated with figures like Al-Kindi and also Al-Khwarizmi, who establishes and systematized the science of algebra, and multiple other polymaths from various ethnic and religious backgrounds, and not restricted only to Abrahamic monotheist scholars, but also Sabaeans. And this legacy develops into various branches of knowledge that are transmitted into Arabic, in mathematics, natural philosophy, treatises on the de anima, mechanics, optics, astronomy, and various other arts that could relate even to architecture. There's various examples of the production of knowledge at that period, including the establishment of instruments of science and some curiosities such as water clocks, the one that we see on the right side, which in itself also indicates in terms of the figurines that it evokes, the multicultural milieu that was marking cities and urban centers such as Baghdad, Basra, Damascus, and even further west in Andalusia. So, for instance, just here we see, the influence of the Indian tradition as evoked by the elephant, the Nubian legacy by the front rider. Behind that front rider, there's a Persian scholar, and then the influence from China evoked with the figure of the dragon, and on top we have an Arab figurine, an overall art of mechanics that comes from the Greek legacy. Now, this whole body of knowledge was systematized, classified by figures like Al-Kindi and Al-Farabi, and also by Ikhwan al-Safa, or the Brethren of Purity, in their Rasail, or epistles, which group 52 treatises that treat all the body of knowledge that was available in their period, which is in the middle of the 10th century. And it is dealing with aspects that relate to arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, geography, music, logic, a focus on natural philosophy, on botany, zoology, a fable even that contains ethical and moral anecdotes. It is known by the title, The Case of the Animals Against the Humans Before the King of the Jinn, and also treatises that deal with psychology, with reflections on aspects of ontotheology, including the occult sciences, whether alchemy, astrology, and also magic. There's also developments that touch upon medicine by polymath, as we see here, for example, the canon of medicine of Ibn Sina, as you all know, a very notable philosopher who had a major impact also in the European scholastic milieu in terms of the reception not only of his medical corpus, but also of his commentaries and metaphysics and the De Anima treatises, and also in logic. But my focus would be, and given that it is a short presentation, my focus will be set on Ibn al-Haytham, which also reflects a more recent direction in terms of my work on the Arabic sciences and philosophy and their reception in the European milieu. And in this case, I focus mainly on the Book of Optics of Ibn al-Haytham, or as he was known in Latin as Al-Hazan. It contains his theory of direct vision and also his reflection on the errors in direct visual perception. And it has also studies that focus on catoptrics and on dioptrics, respectively, the sciences that deal with the reflection of light on polished surfaces that act as mirrors, and also the refraction of light when it passes via translucent or transparent bodies that differ in terms of their opacity or transparency indices. And what marked his tradition is his focus on the development of the rudiments of experimentation, and it is not just based on direct observations, but also on constructing various installations for conducting experimental observations that sometimes involve more than one person in being engaged in the experiment, including the construction of specific installations that are architectural in character and that focus on the camera obscura phenomenon in terms of studying the comportment of light, in terms of its propagation in a rectilinear fashion in a milieu that is transparent, and how it reflects on polished surfaces and refracts as it passes between a transparent medium into another that has a different level of transparency. And those studies that he conducted were particularly done in the context of the Fatimid milieu in Egypt, even though he started his career as an architect and surveyor in Iraq, but then went to Egypt on the account that he could contribute to the designing of a water barrier that controls the ebb and flow of the Nile River. But upon failing from meeting this task as an architect, he feared from being persecuted and feigned madness. And perhaps it's during that period in the beginnings of the 11th century that he would have started working on his book of optics. The text itself was translated through various versions into Latin, but the most prominent one must have been particularly the one that is associated with Gerard of Cremona's circle in Toledo. And the translation made its way into the Latin milieu and eventually was received by Franciscan scholars. Particularly, there's a direct influence on Roger Bacon in terms of the Perspectiva part of the Opus Maius. And also there are other lines of the influence of the optics of Ibn al-Haytham in terms of its reception by Theodoric of Freiburg, particularly in a kind of revision of the observations that we find in the optics of Ibn al-Haytham by Theodoric, with a focus on the theory of color and the rainbow, which comes in line with a parallel investigation of the same phenomenon by a Persian scholar in the beginnings of the 14th century, who was working in the Maragha Observatory in Iran. And we see a lot of parallels between what Theodoric of Freiburg presented as a revision of the theory of the rainbow of Ibn al-Haytham with the one that we find in Arabic by Kamal al-Din al-Farisi. And it is particularly stating that ultimately the phenomenon of color is a phenomenon that pertains to the to light and is not indicative of the existence of colors as ontologically in a kind of realm that is parallel to that of light. So they are directly coming from the decomposition of physical light. And one of the observations is undertaken by way of studying the behavior of light as it passes through a sphere that is made of glass that contains water, which simulates the rain droplet. And the focus of Theoderic of Freiburg from one side and Kamal ad-Din al-Farisi from the other side was on the rain droplet rather than on the mist, a cloud, or that Ibn al-Haytham evoked in terms of his study of this phenomenon. And we see parallels of this in the right side here in the bottom, in the dioptrique of Descartes of the study. And what I'm showing here on top is a reconstruction that I've done with a, in an article that I published on specifically on this phenomenon, where I study the trajectories of light as it passes through this simulation of the rain droplet, which replicates what we find in Ibn al-Haytham's study on the role of spherics in the consideration of aspects that relate to the reflection and refraction of light, but also here applied to a natural phenomenon that relates to the rain droplet to come with a new theory of the rainbow. And this is one of the examples where we see a continuation of the engagement with Ibn al-Haytham's work, whether in the European milieu or in the Islamicate context, and how it makes its way even into the 17th century with the case of Descartes. The reception also of Ibn al-Haytham's optics goes even further into realms that relate to architecture and the visual arts, where the perspectiva naturalis that is associated with his book of optics is transformed into a form of perspectiva artificialis as a form of projection that aids the articulation in a spatial and representational form of the pictorial arts and painting, but also can act as a device for architectural design. So in the case of the reception in the architectural milieu, there's a direct impact on Leon Battista Alberti in the De Pictura, but also in the applications of the perspectiva in architectural design by Alberti. And also there's a direct impact on the third commentary of Lorenzo Ghiberti. And there's a use of the optics of Ibn al-Haytham as a basis for understanding the physiological and psychological aspects of vision, which relate to a new kind of theory of mind that develops out of the science of optics of Ibn al-Haytham. The work itself was translated into Latin, and it was printed in 1572 under the editorship of Friedrich Reisner in Basel. And Catherine de' Medici was the patron of this particular endeavor. And the optics of Ibn al-Haytham, Kitab al-Manadir, is referred to here as the Optica Thesaurus al-Hazini Arabis, and it contains also the commentary of the Franciscan Polish scholar who followed in great detail and attention the work of Ibn al-Haytham in terms of writing a commentary that is closely connected with the original text, as it is here mediated via the Latin translation. And we see also the continuation of the impact of the optics of Ibn al-Haytham in terms of its reception in the mathematical school of Antwerp, and in particular through the work of François d'Aiguillon, also an architect, but interested in the science of optics. And here we're talking about the beginnings of the 17th century in terms of the reception and commentary on Ibn al-Haytham's tradition and that of Ptolemy and Euclid by François d'Aiguillon in the Opticorum. And we see etchings by Rubens here on the some samples of them that replicate some of the experiments that Ibn al-Haytham describes in his book of optics. And one of them is of particular interest, is the upper one on the right side, which shows the muses entering into some kind of conversation and engagement with the experimenter. And in this case, there's on the right side, a focus on the frontal part of the brain as being the fundamental in terms of the understanding of how natural eyesight occurs, versus the other muses are engaged with a dissection of the eyes. And ultimately, this refers to the two trajectories in the reception of the optics of Ibn al-Haytham. One of them is particularly focused on the mathematized physics of the behavior of natural light and how it enters into the eyes, and how the various membranes of the eyes act as instruments of catoptrics and dioptrics, until that physical light touches the crystalline within the eye, which acts both as a kind of lens, but at the same time as a sensing organ, which senses the light as a kind of faint type of pain, which Ibn al-Haytham describes as being something akin to when we look at the sun for a short period of time, and it leaves that kind of burning sensation onto the eyes. So that focus is particularly on the physiology of the eye, and also the connection of the optic nerves with the frontal part of the brain. But then there is another layer to Ibn al-Haytham's discussion of vision, that visual perception cannot occur but with same faculties that relate to brain functions, and that the last sentient in the physical sense is located in the frontal part of the brain. And we see this depicted beautifully here by Rubens in the top right side, where there's a kind of debate or focus on whether it is the psychology of vision that is so fundamental, or is it the physiology and neurology of the role of the eyes and of the optic nerves. And this is an aspect that also relates to two sides of the interpretation of the perspectiva tradition, that one would focus more on linear perspective and on the geometric structuring of perspective, and on turning the two-point perspective into one centering point that corresponds potentially in symbolic form with the frontal part of the brain, versus the one that focuses more on the physiological aspects of an embodied observer, and with the eyes themselves constantly moving in charting what is being seen from the visual environment in which the observer is embedded. And we see further continuations of the reception of Ibn al-Haytham's tradition in the science of optics. Here in the example that we find on the left side with the selenographia of Hevelios. So this is a study on the moon. And here in the frontispiece, two main figures are seen as being founding figures for this new science that is in the 17th century. One of them on the right side is Galileo, and he is bringing to the science of selenography observation as aided by the instrument, that is the telescope that he holds in his hand, and he's standing on the pedestal of sensu, sensation. And on the left side, we see the figure of Al-Hazan or Ibn al-Haytham standing on the pedestal of Ratione, and he's holding a compass and a geometric diagram in his hand. And he's seen more on the theoretical side of the setting down the underpinnings or rudiments of this new 17th century science. There are other aspects that relate to the reception of the perspectiva tradition also in the work of Girard Desargues. and particularly as they are applied in perfecting the arts of architecture and also of cutting stones for masonry in a way that works better in terms of their mechanics and load-bearing properties. And then there's another layer to what I'm doing at present, which is focusing on the dioptrique of Descartes and seeing the elements that trickle down onto it from these earlier perspectiva traditions that take as a main starting point also the optics of Ibn al-Haytham. And, I hope I stayed within the dedicated time, and this will give us a bit more chance to go more into detail in terms of the wider context of the reception of Ibn al-Haytham as an example of what also happens, but in a different parallel tradition, with Ibn Sina, Avicenna, or Averroes, Ibn Rushd, or Jabir ibn Hayyan, or Ibn Tufail in terms of also the Hay ibn Yaqzan tale, and many other figures that became also part of the development of European philosophical and scientific ideas from the High Middle Ages onwards. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Nader, for that thoughtful and very insightful paper. We've got time for questions if any hands want to go up. I might jump in first, just because I knew Lawrence's would go up. I might jump in first ahead of Lawrence, simply because we know Ibn al-Haytham was very influential for the sciences, physics, for people like Galileo and Newton. And you mentioned his philosophy of mind, and I wondered how influential his contributions there were for European philosophy of mind or psychology, the development of those in European philosophies.
I see it more visibly in the commentaries that we find in the Perspectiva part of Roger Bacon, for instance, where he keeps, in every folio almost, he's contrasting him with Ibn Sina. So that's where, there is a focus more on the role of the faculties in terms of how they are, they interact in terms of letting sight be a proper one rather than being prone to error. So that's one aspect. You see it also in Lorenzo Ghiberti, where he takes a different kind of trajectory than Alberti by focusing more on the physiological and psychological aspects of vision. But what this entails is ultimately, once there is, the effect of light as a sensation within the optic nerves as they reach the frontal part of the brain, what happens afterwards is an interplay of imagination, discernment, the enactment of some form of syllogism, and the role of memory. They are all intertwined, and Ibn al-Haytham adds to this that you need some kind of an embodied situation in which the observer is capable of being connected with what is being seen by a continuous sort of ground. And he constructs, I didn't put it here, but he constructs an installation that is similar to what in the 1950s is called the Ames room. The Ames room is you look through an aperture and you believe that, what you're seeing in the other space is, a regular kind of rectilinear room. But you might see there a puppy that is the size of an elephant with respect to the human being. And this is because the ground and the ceiling and the back wall are all articulated in a way that, gives that semblance that one corner where you stand is much higher than another one that is supposedly closer to the eye of the observer. And he did an installation, evidently not as sophisticated as this one, but in which he tested various observations by random observers that looked through an aperture to determine the positioning of objects in the anterior space. And this is something similar to the perception of depth, la perception de la profondeur. So these are some of the facets of his take on rudiments of a philosophy of mind.
Thank you very much. John and then Lawrence. John?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm sorry you can't see me, though that doesn't really matter. In fact, it may be that your question, Aaron, anticipated mine, because I picked up this phrase about a new theory of mind. And it may be that, Nader, you answered that already in answering Aaron, but if there were other things that you wanted to say about that, I'd be interested. But perhaps also to add to that, I suppose when people talk about theories of mind, and I wonder whether mind is the best word to use, but what one thinks of theories, especially perhaps about theories about the way in which what goes on in the intellect, which would have been thought of as immaterial, is related to what goes on in the brain, and which was thought to be discussed physically. And what you seem to have said in connection even with Al-Itham is a lot to do with his work on the brain and what's going on there. And I wondered if he also thought about these sort of other connections.
He will evoke other connections by way of abstract concepts that we form. So how we, and that's where, the multiplication of species would fit in terms of the reception of his thinking by a figure like Roger Bacon. So he's not saying that, he doesn't follow the kind of prevalent Neoplatonist tradition that would have been, quite widespread philosophically amongst his peers or people within the era in which he flourished. So he's not talking about, an active intellect, or he talks about the act of discernment as a cognitive property, how we remember things, dhakira, recollection or memory, how imagination is evoked as a faculty, and he uses the term qiyas, which is an enactment of syllogism through which you determine the identity of what you see. And what helps in that is a classification in terms of what he refers to as species. But ultimately, what is happening is that these faculties are tied to the brain, but he cannot determine in which regions of the brain this is active. All he could say in terms of his thinking is that given that what he observes in terms of anatomy, evidently not done on human beings, but done on animals, that ultimately those optic nerves, they separate right side, left side, they connect, and then they separate again and reconnect in the frontal part of the brain. But he situates that kind of workings of the faculties as being tied to the brain without being capable of determining which parts of the brain are active when we evoke imagination, memory, discernment, the enactment of a syllogism. So that's what makes him different than most, the ones that are more philosophically leaning in terms of their take on what we might call mind. And he uses malakat al-dhihn, and dhihn is almost like the cognitive mind, or the mind as it is cognizing. rather than evoking anything that is related to the notion of aql per se, which is that could evoke the notion of nous. This is not his take on the faculties.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Thank you very much.
Lawrence.
Yeah, Nader, thank you so much for your paper. I wanted to, my question was really related to Aaron's and to John's. When Descartes writes about imagining, I mean, we tend to think of imagining as a productive faculty. You project the imagination, but he always uses the passive infinitive imaginari to be imagining, or rather to be receiving images. And I wanted to ask you about the metaphysical aspect of that, because it strikes me that there's a connection here with the way that truth is to be understood. That it seems, but I have in mind that Newton is extremely concerned with optics, so is Descartes. But all of the question for me is why? Why are they so bothered by this? And what is it about the imposition of images upon us that is so important for them? In other words, what are the phenomenological roots of the relation to truth of what is known, or is that in play here?
Yes, but it starts with his engagement with Aristotle, for instance, and Plato. He's not satisfied with either of these two figures in terms of giving an explanation of how natural vision occurs. So to his mind, the Aristotelian tradition, in terms of what it offers as an intromission theory of vision, gets it right, and in the broad sense of how to understand the vision, but it needs a mathematical framework to figure out ultimately not only the impress of a kind of image of sorts that is passively mediated via imagination, but the actual happening of some kind of a correspondence point by point between what we might take to be the image of something, meaning its actual physical properties as an observable object of vision, and how it is emitting from every point on it, right? Lights in every direction, but there is a point-by-point correspondence between the sensations that are left from specific direct rays of light that come from the object of vision and enter into the eye to leave an impress in the back of the eye on the optic nerves, which means that ultimately what we might call an image of something is the impress of the light that is coming or emitted from that particular configuration in the physical world, and how it is leaving an actual physiological sensation on the back of the eye that translates into a sensation in the optic nerve. So that's one part of what he offers. And to understand this, we need the geometric framework that is the one that he finds in the extramission theory of vision. But he says ultimately it's not the light coming out from the eyes, but there is a cone, a virtual cone, which is the range of clarity in direct vision. Each eye has a cone. Its vertex is in the center of its, of that eye, right and left. And he studies also the considerations where these cones that relate to the light entering into the eye intersect to cause, errors in vision, such as, double vision. So he studies the notion of truth. For him can be accomplished by way of establishing the grounds for proper observations. So if we want to use a modern parlance, to have observational data, I need to have a sound method. Otherwise, in most cases, vision or visual perception is prone to error. And he dedicates 2 volumes actually in his optics just to describe errors of vision, which relate to multiple factors, not only in the observer or in the healthiness of the eyes, but, or most importantly in the way the faculties are themselves, functioning properly, but also what happens in the ambient environment. So he's concerned with truth. He wants to have an experimental method of explanation, demonstration, verification, but that experimental method is very much dependent on observation, which means that he needs to control within it the parameters in which observation can occur. And that's how he presents his if we want to talk about truth, it is a verification that happens experimentally. If it is not available experimentally, I rely on prior knowledge.
Just to follow up on that, how then does Descartes respond to Ibn al-Haytham in terms of if Descartes is prioritizing the intellectus or the methodus of the intellectus over the senses? How does Descartes directly engage with Ibn al-Haytham?
It's the engagement that I'm noticing in the dioptrique in terms of the anatomy of the eyes, the membranes that the light passes through, the behavior of light as it passes between 2 different transparent media that are, that differ in their refractive properties. And in terms of the kind of correspondence point by point between the objects of vision and what they leave as a corresponding impress within the eye, and taking into account also a phenomenon that is related to the camera obscura, which is the inversion that would happen of the image of what is seen, but it is redressed also as it passes via the crystalline and vitreous. So there he's very close. And in terms of phenomena that relate to the rainbow, but there's no correspondence at the level of the philosophical take on what we might call mind or
Sure.
Yeah.
Lovely, thank you very much. Well, we are just about out of time, and there are no more hands up. So could we thank Nader again for a wonderful paper?
Thank you.
And we'll meet again next week for my paper. Thank you very much.
Brilliant.
See you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nader.